Welcome to Kotlin Beginner series and start with basics. And this basics covers how to declare a variable and its type in Kotlin and what are the basic types in Kotlin and type inference and then loops and then control flow as expressions. So how to declare a variable in Kotlin, and there is two types of variables we can declare in Kotlin, that is mutable and immutable variables. The variables which is declared with var keyword and that is mutable, and so and the variables which we declare with the val and that is immutable. And in Java language we have a keyword called final. So when you place a final keyword prefix to the declaration, and then once the value is assigned and that value cannot be changed. In the same way that val is once value is assigned and that cannot be changed. So we can define a variable like x of string. See, this value can be changed to another string. So we can define a variable, the val, so that is once it is assigned and that cannot be changed. And it will show so it shows compile time errors because the variable which defined with val is constant and this cannot be changed. The variable with defined with x and that is this data can be changed. So another strong feature of Kotlin is type inference. When I declare a variable with a string and the string is a data type and we declare a variable x with a string as a data type, and this is the variable name and this is the data type, so that I am assigning the test. The type inference that Kotlin provides us that feature is that even if we don't mention this data type and it infers from the value it is assigned, and so when the value string is assigned, so it infers that the x data type of x is string. So type inference, and this is not only for the variables, and it type inference is applies for closures also. We can define a closure. The closure is a function type and it takes arguments as int and returns the int. So we can just define the closure like this. It infers that and this the type we defined as a function type is it takes the function takes the arguments as int and return as a int, and when you define the function body for that, and it is automatically enforce the type so that we don't need to explicitly provide the data type for that argument. So what are the basic types available in Kotlin? The basics types available in Kotlin is, in Java we have primitive data types. So in Kotlin there is no primitive data types, everything is talks in terms of object. In Java we have wrapper classes to convert this primitive data types to object, and JVM it will unbox it at runtime. But in Kotlin there is no primitive data types, and everything is in terms of objects. So primitive data types also is defined as a class data type, so there's an object of that class. So all data types are class type, including primitive data types. So there is a different categories of data types, and that is the numbers. So within number we have the types called long, int and short, byte and float and double. So respectively it occupies the memory. So type conversion. So how to convert from long to int and short to byte and float to double. So this is the as it is the class, long is a class data type. It has got some methods to change that to convert into the another variable. So where I define the I as 10, and then if I want to change it to the string, so I just I to string. So we have a methods on that class, and you just call it, and it's anything float to double, double to float, anything we can just call that method, or I too long. So that is type conversion. And so in type conversion between the long and int and short byte, and this is just we can call that method respective method to that. And then booleans, and then we have called chars, and string is same as Java language. In Java the string is immutable class, and here also it is immutable class. And one exception is that the extra feature it is added in Kotlin is that, and the string can have a reference to the variable. That means that the string some value, and that we can refer that x value and print here, and then that is the string can have a value of x. Arrays, and then Kotlin it doesn't treat arrays as a special type, and then Kotlin arrays is treat like a collections. Can just define like array, then just array of, can I just add so it is though it is treat like a collections, and then we can initialize another array. And just define as it also. So arrays is just so we can initialize the array with like this. So array is size, and then that each element, and it is that the index it is passed to that function, and then it is square it, and then each element will have the value of that square of that index. So you can print that array other of say 4, and it should print 16. That's it. So array is just like is just like a collections in Kotlin. The stores as objects and unbox as primitive in JVM. So array store is just like a collection and stores as objects, and it is primitive type, so it is stored in that arrays. So and at runtime in JVM it unboxes to the primitive types. So provides array class specialized for each of the primitive data types. So the Kotlin provides the array classes specialized for each of the primitive data types. And so if you want to omit this unboxing and boxing and unboxing of the primitive types, we can store primitives in array directly. So for that, Kotlin provides us that there is a data type called char array, short array, int array, and boolean array. Just we can define int array, and then that can be of size so print the so it is direct compiler itself, and compiler will not do any boxing there. It's directly primitive types can be handled. If you would directly primitive types will be primitive as a data type, and compiler it recognizes as primitive as data type. uh, so in Kotlin, then how we define a loops, and then how it defines that control flow. So I can define just a range of values like this, A to Z, with a and I can just print ln whether that B is in that range. So that is the range operator, that operator which is Kotlin provides us that some of operators like range or in, and so so that can be used directly. And like we have a 1 to 9, and that I can just print, I can just assign that range of the values. So I can print when it 1 is 1 to 9. So another is we can range in step 2 and 1 to 9. Just I would like to have only odd numbers, then I can use like step method on that. So then even numbers will not be there, so it should keep that false. That's it. And we can define the range. And 10 down to 0. So it will have 0 to 10. Like this we can define, and then it will have the series of the values 0 to 10. Next we have various methods like this, and we can just define the range is 10 range to 100. So it will have the values of 10 and then the 9 in the range should be false. So what about for loops? And then for loops are the same, and some value x in down to 10, and then I want to print it. So any data type which is implemented by iterator, and that can be printed here. Any variable, it's any data type which is implemented the iterator, so that can be here. So the in operator works, and then with the for loop, and then it prints that value. So one of the feature of that control flow blocks, and that is like if or when statements are here. It is in Java, there is these statements are these are if blocks or when blocks are called as statements, but in Kotlin these are expressions and return a value. Let's define one expression, something like 0, that the number which is passed, I want to return is like is 0 or not. So if statement itself it returns, the statement itself is returns, is expression, it's not a statement. So if x equal to 0, true, else false. So I'm passing as 10, so it should print is 0 is false. So we don't need to explicitly return the statements, and then you can just if statement itself is expression. If you perform some operations before return true, you can just do like this also. And there is x equal to x plus 1, and then print ln x, and then it's true. So I can do some functionality over here, and the last statement will be a return to that. That should be, by default it passed by values, so I can just define our variable x and can manipulate that. So now it prints and cast with the keyword as, so type cast. The word can be defined passing any, and so one can as string, typecast that as a string, and then print. So it prints x, and that is a smart cast, and when variable checks for type, it becomes the type of that variable in the block. If x is string, so can just in that block, so once check is done, and then it infers that x is a string, and we don't need any explicit casting, so we can test. So here is, in this if condition, it is checking whether the x is a string or not, and when it comes into the block, so that throughout that block, and it read that x is, it infers x as a string, so we don't need to explicit casting, and then you can just call method on that. And null optionals. So in Java we don't have any concept called optionals. In Kotlin, by default, the null cannot be assigned to any variable. I define a class and test. So I define x of text. So I can't assign a null value to that. By default, I cannot assign the null value to that instance of the class. So the Kotlin provides as an optional. If we want to assign it as a null, we need to just suffix with a question mark. So then only it is checks for the null. So when there is any operation is performed on that, and then whether it is checks, and then call that. Yes. So by default, the Kotlin any variable cannot be assigned to the null, and if it's to be assigned, it has to be data type should be prefix with the optional, and then when you access that property of that name property of that object, so just we replace or just call that question mark on that. If it is not null, then only it access, otherwise if it is null, and that will be if I assign a null to that, it won't crash, and it just displays null. That is called optional. So the next is type hierarchy, and so the super type is any for all data types, and the super type is any, and then we have called unit and nothing, and when you define a function, so it doesn't return anything, but it is when you call in Java it is called void, and function doesn't return anything. But in Kotlin, that is that unit is a class, and that is a singleton class, and that indicates that function if function doesn't return, it's return, but it's by default it returns that unit class instance, singleton instance. That, and one more called nothing. And so nothing is a data type, but we can't create any instance to that. The most useful in here is that actually should the function must return a value, but when I declare as a nothing, and then runtime when I'm throwing runtime exception, so I don't need to return anything here, I just call report error. But actually in Java, and that should be written, something must be written. So when it is an error, even in error condition, something must be written. But this nothing, this kind of nothing is a data type. It doesn't create any instance, but it's just useful in this type of scenarios. So these are all covered in as part of basics.